Hello, everyone. I'm Anna Grzymowska. I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Karis Templeman, who is currently a research fellow at WCED. He graduated from the University of Rochester and got his PhD from the best PhD granting institution of all, i.e. Michigan. His primary research interests include democratization, political parties and institutions, and the politics of East and Southeast Asia. His dissertation, which is fantastic and I highly recommend, focused on the origins and decline of dominant party systems around the world and the puzzle of how authoritarian regimes can hold on to power by holding elections. His other research, some of which is being published in Comparative Political Studies, one of the premier journals, includes work on the effects of regime change on military spending and alliances, and on constitutional design in divided societies. And today we're delighted to welcome him as he presents on After the Revolution, Patterns of Competition in New Electorally Contested Regimes. So, welcome. Well, welcome back.
Yeah, welcome back. Yeah. All right, can everyone hear me all right? Yeah. Yes, wonderful. All right, well, thanks for making the trek out here on a chilly Tuesday afternoon. The title of this talk has changed a little bit. I know it confused a couple people. I should preface my remarks by saying originally I was thinking of talking specifically about my regional area of expertise, which is East Asia and Southeast Asia. And then as I put the talk together, I realized I needed to draw on a much larger set of cases, really to say something relevant to the question I'm going to pose. Without further ado, let me jump into this. So I'm a research fellow at the Weiser Institute this year, and I would like to thank Anna in particular for setting that up for me. And the mission of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, as I understand it, is to help countries in transition that are going through some kind of democratic transition from authoritarianism to democracy. Let's see, should I take these lights down? There, is that better? Oh, okay, great. All right. So the mission of the Weiser Center is to focus on transitions from authoritarianism to democracy, and to perhaps provide some guidance for countries going through that transition today. To give you some background on the patterns of these transitions, this is just a simple diagram taken from Polity, which measures regime types around the world from 1800 on. This is taken from about World War II on, and you can see the major change in the number of democracies occurs right at the end of the Cold War. There's a big spike, the blue line up here. So we have a much larger number of democracies in the world now. So we have many more cases to draw on in kind of understanding how this process takes place. You also note that there's a sizable jump in the number of kind of middling cases that aren't closed autocracy but aren't full democracies either, the black line. And those cases have become more common and have in recent years been a subject of a lot of study. And then finally, the red line summarizes or captures the closed authoritarian regimes such as China or North Korea. Saudi Arabia is included in this. And you can see after the Cold War there's been a real decline in that, and that decline has continued. And so increasingly, the Chinas and North Koreas of the world today are becoming, they're increasingly exceptional. And the modal pattern of authoritarianism today actually involves some kind of elections or contestation for power, but through elections that maybe are neither free nor fair nor held regularly. All right. To give you a sense of what this looks like globally, so this is in 2009. You can see red is bad if you like democracy, blue is good. All right. And the red, China obviously stands out. Central Asia is another area of quite autocratic countries. And then the Middle East and North Africa is the other area that really jumps out. Latin America and Eastern Europe, by contrast, are places that really, from the end of the Cold War or slightly before until 2009, really made a lot of progress in this. And so if you're interested in democracy in transition, the big area to focus on right now is actually the Middle East. Okay. I don't have much of a background in Middle Eastern studies, so I'm taking a bit of a leap here and exploring a region that as where things are happening, where the action is today. And I'm going to despite not having that background, I'm going to try to say something about the larger patterns of democratization that I hope is relevant for a couple of the cases in the Middle East today. So what do we have in the Middle East? Well, in the last 2 years, we have protests in several countries, Morocco, Jordan, and Bahrain in particular, that have not resulted in a change in regime. We have a more significant result in Libya, Syria, and Yemen, where the state has really broken down either into civil war or into some kind of, I'd say they're all pretty much in civil war now, or some form of that, of military insurrection. And then probably the most promising cases, if what you care about is transitions to democracy, are the regime changes in Tunisia and Egypt. All right. So the question I'm going to pose is, what can political science tell us about the prospects for democratic consolidation in these latter two cases, so particularly Tunisia? And I'm going to focus most of my comments on Egypt because Egypt's a much bigger, really a much more pivotal player in the Middle East. All right. So in particular, I'm going to ask, how likely is it that a semi-permanent Islamic majority comes to dominate the political system? Now, this is a fear that's often voiced, and was particularly voiced before the fall of the authoritarian regime in Egypt, that you had to have autocracy in the Middle East because what would replace it was some kind of theocracy. So people who were concerned about this would point often to Iran as kind of the destiny of a lot of these countries. And so I'm gonna question whether this assumption that Egypt is headed for a semi-permanent Islamic majority is actually true. And I'm gonna raise an alternative in that there might actually be some relatively frequent partisan rotation in power in Egypt, and that. And the answer I'm going to come down on is actually that the latter of these options is I'm an optimist, surprisingly likely, I guess. All right. So let me give you a picture of where we're headed for the rest of the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by one-party dominance, and this work is going to draw on some of my dissertation research. In particular, a lack of ruling party turnover. So if we see an Islamist party come to power in Egypt, is that party going to persist in power indefinitely, or are we likely to see some rotation at some point in the not-too-distant future? I'm going to show you some data on a bunch of other cases drawn from around the world that might get at this question, and then I'm going to come back and talk about Egypt, because it's nice to talk about concrete cases when we deal with these kind of large data sets, and Egypt is in the news. It's kind of fun to think about, and so again, I don't have much of a background in this, but I'm going to jump in and see if I can say something interesting about Egypt. All right. So let me break this down a little bit more. What do we mean specifically by a democratic transition and a consolidation? Here's how I think about it. So first, we have a closed autocratic regime. No elections, no legal opposition, often very stringent restrictions on civil liberties, and that regime breaks down. So there's some kind of instability, the leader is toppled, and there's some uncertainty about who's going to capture power after that. So we have this regime breakdown, and that's when the whole thing starts. That's what I would call a transition. Right. Then from the transition phase, we have a bunch of outcomes that could result. So the first outcome, the best from my view, is that we have some kind of election that results in regular electoral contestation that becomes established as a norm, the legitimate means of capturing and holding power, and then we transition into an electorally contested regime. So either a democracy or something just short of democracy. The second path, which appears to be the path that, say, Libya is on right now is some kind of unstable regime where there's a lot of contestation, but that contestation is for the most part extra-legal. So there's militias fighting for power, for instance. And then the third option is that somebody else seizes all the guns, seizes power, and closes down the system again. And so we move from one closed autocracy to another. And so we end up at the third square down at the bottom. Okay. If we happen to make it up to the electorally contested regime, then there's another step. And this doesn't get talked about quite as much. But the way I think about it is there's some regimes in which electoral contestation is established, but one party always wins those. And there's others that have more robust party competition up here, and we transition into democracy. And then we get regular turnover of government. And so what I'm going to focus most of my comments on has to do with this last stage, where we're transitioning from not only an electorally contested regime, but either to democracy or electoral autocracy. We're trying to figure out which of these two outcomes is more likely. All right. To give you some concrete examples about this, here's a couple regimes that transitioned at about the same time, drawn from a region of the world that I know a little better. In Indonesia, we had an authoritarian regime breakdown in 1998. We had kind of a contested transition period. Eventually, elections brought a new president to power, not of the old authoritarian party. And then that president eventually lost, and we had a ruling party turnover, and the new president is of a different party. And so this is, it appears that Indonesia is on this trajectory towards regular partisan turnover. Right. In Cambodia, about the same time, we had a transition to an electorally contested regime in 1998. But the same guy who was in power in the old regime stayed in power in the new regime. And so far, there's been very little indication that the opposition could ever win an election there. So they hold elections. The same party always wins those. All right. If Asia's too far out, this may be a little closer to home. We're trying to figure out why we get Poland in some of these transitions and Russia in some of the others. All right. So let me say a word now about why I'm focusing particularly on party turnover as the main variable that I want to explain. Why is this a good indicator of democratic consolidation? So I'm coming from this originally from a very minimalist conception of what democracy is, and that is, to quote Adam Jaworski, a system in which parties lose elections. And so you want to see rulers flying out of doors. If democracy is the ability to throw bums out, you want to see bums actually flying out. Okay? Why is that important? Well, in part, if bums are worried about losing power, they're going to listen then to voters. And so there's this kind of normative concern about leaders' accountability to voters. So leaders are linked to voters through this uncertainty of the electoral mechanism. All right, and then finally, our very own Anna has put together an argument that I really like about the effect of partisan rotation, or at least uncertainty that you will continue in power, on state institutions. And in particular, rotation in power restrains the impulse to kind of seize everything and to write a bunch of rules that favor the folks in the system, because you may well lose the next election, then be on the outside. And so it ends up promoting a kind of growth of the civil service, a growth of more nonpartisan independent institutions. And so when you get this regular contestation and rotation in power, lots of good things follow from that lead to better functioning democracy. Right? All right, so let me talk a little bit about now my data that I've collected on ruling party duration. This is drawn from a pretty involved data collection project I did as part of my dissertation research. So I looked at all electorally contested regimes in the world from 1950 until 2006. You might ask why you have to do this like country by country, and it turns out that a lot of people have looked just at democracies, a lot of people have looked just at autocracies. If what you're really interested in is this kind of gray area where there is electoral contestation, but those elections aren't necessarily free or fair, then it becomes much harder to figure out what's in your sample. And so I ended up creating my own sample out of basically from scratch. So the final sample had 159 regimes in 142 states, a total of 692 ruling parties. And of those, and this is what I'm going to focus on for the most part, 140 first incumbents, so winners of the first elections that established the regime then. All right. To give you an idea of how the variable is coded, each case in my data set is an incumbent ruling party. So to take an example that hopefully everybody knows, in the US, we have the Republicans and the Democrats. A period of partisan control is a period of Republican control of the presidency. So we get Nixon and Ford. That's 8 years of Republican control. Ford loses, Carter comes in, that's a switch. And then we get 4 years of Democratic control, another switch. When Carter loses, we get 12 years of Republican control and then 8 years of Democratic control. So that's those 8, 4, 4, 8. That's the dependent variable that we're trying to explain here. All right. So let me show you the universe of cases, what an average ruling party is expected to survive at, or how it's expected to survive. All right. And what I have done here is put up a Kaplan-Meier survival curve that predicts or actually measures. Takes all the parties and measures the expected survival at each percentage. Okay, this is actually much more commonly used in medicine. So if you read the New England Journal of Medicine, say, these curves appear a lot. I like to use the analogy of, say, cancer patients here. So if you think of ruling parties as suffering from the disease of incumbency, you want to understand what things predict a higher survival rate or lower survival rate at a given amount of time out. So a couple things to note here. One is that of all parties, the median survival rate here is less than 5 years. Right? So if you are diagnosed as an incumbent ruling party, your survival rate is not very good. Your prospects are not very good on average. All right? If we get about 20 years out, then only 1/10 of ruling parties are alive. So after 20 years, you start to look increasingly exceptional. We wonder if you're drinking some kind of magic potion that keeps you alive for a long time, right? So those start to look weird, funny, way out there, all right? Finally, a couple things to note. There's, in fact, periods where there's a big block, big jump in the survival rate. Can anybody guess why you might have that kind of block, that jump, at particular given moments in time? That's true, but these are very regular. Note that there's a big jump of them all lumped together. So, for instance, at 4 years, what happens at 4 years in many democracies? There's an election, right? So this is a critical point at which a lot of ruling parties lose, right? We can see similar bumps. In fact, 4, 8, 5, and 10 all have that same bump, right? And so elections do seem to affect survival, which we hope it does in democracies, right? All right. So the next question I have is, what about first incumbents? So these are all ruling parties. If we care mostly about the survival of first incumbents, so the Islamists in Egypt, when they win, come to power, do we expect them to last longer than the median, 4 years? Or do we expect them to last less long than 4 years? Well, I've broken the entire set out by first incumbent versus non-first incumbent. And what does this show? it shows that first incumbents, on average, go to the median again, last more than twice as long at the median than non-first incumbents. And so this indicates that there's a first incumbent advantage. You want to be the first party to take power. Okay. So to reiterate this, on average, more than twice as long as subsequent. First incumbents last, on average, more than twice as long as subsequent ruling parties. And I want to emphasize that this result is not quite as obvious or intuitive as it might seem. And I want to emphasize that with some examples. So if you think about transition in Eastern Europe, from communism away from communism, the first parties to take power were often the kind of nascent opposition that had grown up very quickly and rallied in the streets against the communist authorities, took office, and immediately were beset with all of these problems. So they had to negotiate a political transition at the same time that they were trying to move from a centrally planned economy to a market economy. And as a consequence, when the economy went in the tank, a lot of people who had very high expectations about what that transition would deliver blamed the incumbents. And so most of the incumbents, the first incumbents in Eastern Europe, got turned out very quickly, like in a matter of less than a couple of years, usually. Right. And so when I did this initially, I thought this story might actually dominate. And it turns out that's an unusual story when you look at all cases together. And so there's actually a lot of variation that seems to be grouped by region across these cases. Okay. So if we look at, I've broken up the total set of first incumbents by region, 11 regions. The longest, I'll emphasize, not the longest. Western Europe is actually the longest, and there's some interesting reasons for that. But there's an interesting contrast between Eastern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. Most of the regimes that these first incumbents are in went through the transition right at the end of the Cold War, at about the same time. And so we have, even at about the same time, early 90s, in both Sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe, we have very different survival rates of first incumbents. And so this actually poses a very interesting puzzle. Why do you get very short outcomes, short-lived ruling parties in one, very long-lived ruling parties in the other? All right. So to answer this, I'm going to kind of summarize a lot of work very quickly here. I did a qualitative reading of all 140 cases of first incumbents. Okay, so just reading through the histories, what happened there in these cases. And there were three factors that eventually came out of looking at those cases that seemed to contribute to prolonged first incumbent success. So the first is a strong party brand, the second is a disciplined party organization, and a third is control of the creation of the new regime. So let me talk about each of these a little bit. The first, a strong party brand. So the typical, so what's typical in Sub-Saharan Africa, actually, is something like the South African National Congress Party, which in 1994 takes power at the end of apartheid. And what I mean by a strong party brand is there's a huge chunk of the electorate that views voting for the ANC as basically voting for their country. They're the National Liberation Party, right? And so to vote against them is like being unpatriotic in some sense, right? So a lot of the cases in Sub-Saharan Africa actually kind of fit this model. I've listed several others here. Malaysia and Singapore, to some extent, also look this way, where there's a strong attachment to the ruling party, in part because they led the country to independence. And that brand, as we know from political science research, if you have a strong partisan attachment, that often lasts for a generation or more in the electorate. And so that advantage can persist for 20 or 30 years in some cases. The second, a disciplined party organization, is very well illustrated by the Congress Party in India, where In the first elections, the Congress Party was the only party that could compete across the entire country. India was broken up into a lot of regionally concentrated groups in opposition to Congress. And so Congress ran candidates everywhere. And simply because of that organizational reach, they were at a tremendous advantage initially. And it took something like 30 years for that advantage to decay. And there are a lot of other parties as well that kind of look similar to Congress in this regard, where they're the only parties running candidates everywhere. So Cameroon, Mexico, Mozambique, Seychelles, and Tanzania. Right. And then the final case, the final criterion is the ability as the incumbent. Often you're a hegemon or an autocratic party in a closed regime, and you slowly liberalize things. But because you're in control, you basically write the rules for the way subsequent competition plays out. And so you can write the rules to your advantage. Great illustration of this is in Mexico, where the longtime incumbent PRI faced growing challenges from both a leftist party and a rightist party. Those two parties had a hard time cooperating against the PRI because they were at opposite ends of the political spectrum in Mexico. And the PRI actually encouraged this kind of confrontation between the two groups by redoing the electoral system so that you could only win proportional representation seats if you ran candidates in individual districts. And so rather than cooperating, the two opposition parties then ran candidates against each other and the PRI in each district. And so that contributed then to continued opposition, the difficulty of opposition coordination. Okay. You see this same pattern in several other cases that have long-lived ruling parties. So in Taiwan, in Cameroon, Kenya, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. All right. So that may explain some of the regional variation we get here. In many of the sub-Saharan cases, we had a former autocrat gradually democratizing or gradually moving towards, I shouldn't say democratizing, but gradually moving towards more contested elections, but kind of limiting the pace and scope of that liberalization in a way that really benefited them and in many cases contributed to their persistence in power. In Eastern Europe, by contrast, we had the complete collapse of most of the communist parties and the kind of rapid ascension of parties that had been founded, weeks or even days before they took office, and so they didn't have the same kind of organizational capacity or partisan following in the electorate that you got in many of the sub-Saharan cases. And we can tell similar stories to some degree for a lot of the other variation here. All right. Yeah. Let me just pause here. Mm-hmm.
I'm actually having brain cramp, but if
Yep.
the data starts in 1950, how do you have 11 first incumbent parties in Western Europe?
So there's a bunch of cases where there was, so Spain, Greece, Southern Europe. And then there's several cases where, so West Germany, Austria, I think Norway is in there as a first incumbent because, so I should caution, if the party was in power in 1950, I went back further until to see when it started. So in some of those cases, like in Sweden, that meant going back to 1936. Yeah. So that captures a couple more as well. So 1950 is kind of an upper bound on that duration. Okay. So I've described some general patterns which I think contribute to ruling party longevity. Ideally, I'd like to measure these more systematically, and ideally, I'd like to go out and collect, maybe American National Election Studies style data on, voter support for different parties. It's hard to get that for a place like Djibouti in 1977. So as a proxy, I I've actually looked at the first incumbent's vote and seat share, and it actually does a pretty good job of predicting the relative size of the first incumbent's victory in the first election actually does a pretty good job of predicting how well it will fare 10 or 20 years out. And so I've used a couple different measures, and I'll just show you these briefly. So the first incumbent vote share minus the runner-up vote share in the first lower house election, and then I've done the same thing with seat share. What that does is actually, I think, captures a big chunk of the variation as well. So this is if I've just broken this out by whether the vote share is greater than 20% or less than 20%. So imagine, say, the Democrats won 65%, Republicans won 35%. They'd be in this group. If it's 55-45, they'd be in this group. Okay. So 65-35 lead in votes is pretty large, and it turns out that is reflected in survival here. We can see the same thing to a little bit lesser degree with the seat lead. So if there's a large seat lead, and it turns out, I played around with different cutoffs here. It turns out that 20% tends to capture the most variation between the groups here. A third thing that I've looked at is whether the first incumbent controlled both houses of the legislature and the executive. And we see the same kind of pattern. If they do, they last longer, not surprisingly, than if they don't. So let me draw some quick conclusions from this general stuff, and then I'll turn to talking specifically about Egypt again. So it does appear that there's a first mover advantage. So being first, all else equal, does give you a longer survival prediction. The things that contribute to that appear to be superior partisan appeal and party organization, and also the ability to reshape the institutions of the state. And then a good proxy for that, and a good way to kind of assess or countries that are just going through this kind of transition is to look at the incumbent party's performance in the founding elections. So what I'm going to do in a moment is actually look at the performance of the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood in particular in Egypt, and kind of compare that to a lot of the other really long-lived ruling parties out there. So the question I want to ask is the Muslim Brotherhood a dominant party in the making? Does it look like one that's going to be around for a long time in power? So let me give you a little bit of background on Egypt before I answer this question. So the key events, there's a lot, but the key events from my perspective are there's protests. They force the incumbent Mubarak, who's been around for 30 years. He's forced out. The military takes over. And then there's about a year and a half transition to the direct election of a new president that ends or it transitions into parliamentary elections about a year after Mubarak, a little before a year after Mubarak is forced out. That parliament is subsequently dissolved on court order, and so there's a lot of back and forth between the old regime and the new elected officials. There's then a presidential election in June of 2012. Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood wins that election. The Muslim Brotherhood, of which he's a part, also came in first in the parliamentary election. And then Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood play the leading role in writing a new constitution, and that constitution was just adopted in a referendum with fairly low turnout just a couple of months ago. And then there's a new parliamentary election scheduled in just a couple of months. So what I'm particularly interested in is whether we can kind of get some sense of just how strong the Muslim Brotherhood is relative to the other parties in the system and whether that's likely to persist. So here are the parliamentary results for the first election. And I'd highlight a couple of things. One, the Muslim Brotherhood is listed at the top here. They won about 37.5% of the vote. Right. Significantly ahead of the second place party, the Islamic Block, which is even more strongly Islamic than the Muslim Brotherhood. And so this basic result gives you a sense that the Islamics have the Islamist supporters, people who want a greater role for Islam in public life, have a clear majority, and they end up with a clear majority of the seats as well. If you look at seat share, there's a couple things that are interesting for my argument here. One is that the percentage of the seats minus the percentage of the votes, so the seat bonus that each party got. Turns out the Muslim Brotherhood got this big seat bonus. And that was in part by being the leading party. It was also in part because they actually are a much more disciplined, organized political party than most of the other parties running. And in particular, the incumbent National Democratic Party of Mubarak splintered apart and actually ran a bunch of independent candidacies, small parties, and did a very poor job of converting votes into seats. And so if this is the picture you have of Egypt, this suggests that, in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood, or at least the Islamic Alliance, looks like they have a clear majority and are in good shape for the future. The presidential election kind of complicates this picture a lot more. So the first round, the Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood Party candidate, is shown at the top. He comes in first, but barely, with less than a quarter of the vote. And the second place candidate, who has ties to the old regime, wins almost a quarter of the vote as well. And then the other half and more of votes are distributed across a bunch of other candidates. All right. And then in the final, in the second round, we get a very closely contested election, and so the Muslim Brotherhood's advantage looks much slimmer here. They're not able to deliver nearly as large a percentage of the vote as they were able to capture in the parliamentary election. Now, these were spread out about 6 months apart. And in fact, one of the speculations that I've read is that the Muslim Brotherhood lost a lot of support even in between those 6 months. Thinking about specifically the Muslim Brotherhood's chances of dominance, in their favor, given what I've said from the broad comparative study that I've done, they do have a strong party brand, and it's clearly able to attract more votes than any other party in the system right now. Although I would emphasize the Islamic Block, who are even more hard right on Islam than the Muslim Brotherhood, were able to attract a surprising amount of the vote. And so if the Muslim Brotherhood is kind of all popular, it's a little odd that a lot of people are defecting to this other party. Second, the Muslim Brotherhood does have a very impressively disciplined party organization that does seem to up their odds of survival. And then finally, they did have a strong hand in shaping the new constitution. If and when that comes into effect, they're likely to be in a better position than they otherwise would. That said, I do think there are some very significant factors working against dominance, particularly in contrast to a lot of the other long-lived ruling parties in my sample. And that the first is that they have a very weak grip on state institutions. And you can see this just in news reports from Egypt on a weekly basis. There's the security, the courts, civil service, all of these are still largely loyal to the old regime in the military, and so the Muslim Brotherhood is in a major fight to try to assert control over those. Second, because they are the leading party in the parliament and they now control the presidency, in some sense they're the new boss, and so the economy in Egypt has done quite poorly over the last couple of years, and we know that sooner or later, people start to blame the incumbents when the economy does badly. And so they really own that problem now. And so I haven't seen any recent polling data, but I suspect their popularity is declining a fair amount simply because of economic problems. And then finally, and I can talk about this a lot more in the Q&A if you'd like. But Egypt has a presidential system. You notice the presidential election here produced quite a different result from the parliamentary election. This is not specific to Egypt. This is a general pattern where presidential elections are, in fact, much more unpredictable. It's much more difficult to translate a certain block of support into continued control of the executive if you're in a presidential regime than in a parliamentary one. And so I would suggest pretty likely that you'll have some kind of independent candidate kind of rise up to challenge Morsi, or if he's succeeded by another Muslim Brotherhood candidate, that candidate, and potentially win out on the basis of his own popularity. Compared to dominant parties of the past, I would suggest the Muslim Brotherhood does not look particularly formidable. And in fact, if I had to guess average survival times, I would just go straight back here, look at first incumbent parties, and we'll go about here. So maybe about 10 years. I'd give them 2 terms. So that's my attempt to say something interesting about the Middle East. Thanks. I welcome your comments and questions.